Good morning, everybody. All right. So today we are taking up Gate 99 of the 108 Gates of Dharma-Illumination. We are steaming toward the end. Okay. So today's gate statement says, Stillness is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it realizes and is replete with the samadhi of the Tathagata. So this is another gate that requires us to look carefully at the words, right? Because it's pointing back to some old Sanskrit vocabulary. So when I saw that this first word had been translated stillness, I thought, well, that must be jaku, stillness of nirvana, right? This is a term or a word that pops up a lot in our tradition. And when I looked at the kanji, yes, indeed, jaku is there, but it's in combination with another one, jakujo. Taken together, that means samadhi. So there's more than one word for samadhi in this gate, which I think is kind of interesting. We'll get into that before the end, right? So let's start with this jaku. Peaceful, quiet, tranquil, right? No wonder it has this connotation of stillness. There's also a sense of something being extinguished, and this is the pointer toward nirvana. So you may already be familiar with the fact that our tradition says we reach nirvana when we blow out or extinguish fires that keep us tied to suffering and rebirth in samsara, right? Those fires have to do with, guess what? Greed, anger, and ignorance. Our old friends, the three poisons. So when we blow out those fires, we are released from the grasping, the clinging, right, that go with our habituated thinking. We're free from the cycle of rebirth. We reach something called nirvana. So in the early teachings, there are two kinds of nirvana. One is that, the three poisons, the other hindrances, delusions, obstacles no longer arise, but we still have this physical karmic body. In the other form, the body has also been extinguished, so with it go all the limitations of being in this human form. So it's this state of eternal calm. So this is what we mean when we say an awakened being has died or entered nirvana. Right, so for instance, Shakyamuni's official death date in February is what we celebrate as Nirvana Day, right? So interestingly, the kanji for jaku is also used when we're writing the death dates of clergy. So such and so, day this person entered nirvana. So I guess when I die, the assumption is I've led a good practice life. I've been successful somehow. I've blown out the fires of my three poisons. I've gone beyond having a body. I've landed in nirvana. So I hope that's what happens for you, and you, and you. Right? We'll see. We'll see where the four of us end up. So this is the stillness of jaku. So in the jo of jaku, it has a feeling of being settled or being established. So we can see why we have this feeling about jakujo, to be settled in stillness, to be established in stillness. Thus, this translation is samadhi, right? So all this is pointing to concentrating the mind, letting go of delusion, letting go of distraction. This is where we unify body and mind in a very deep way. So Todo-san has written, serenity is a translation of jakujo, quiet, tranquil, serene, or solitary. This does not simply mean silent or without noise in the external world. When our mind is torn into two or more pieces, there are always dispute, conflict, or anxiety. Such conditions make our mind unsettled and agitated. More often, when we sit in the quiet zendo, we begin to hear the noise from inside. Our zazen of letting go of thoughts allows us to sit immovably without being pulled by those conditions. So we also find the stillness of nirvana in Shihoin, or the four seals. Sometimes it's the three seals, but for our purpose today, it's the four seals. Uchiyama Roshi says these four seals summarize all of Buddhism. So these things are really important, very central to our practice tradition. First is that all phenomena are impermanent. Second is that everything is suffering. Third is that there is no self. And fourth is, guess what? Nehan jakujo, nirvana is tranquility. So we can experience this kind of tranquility when we stop the clinging that comes from the three poisons that drive these fires, that keep us stuck. So when we understand impermanence, we see the basis of suffering. When we understand impermanence of suffering, we understand there is no permanent fixed self-nature that we can cling to. And then on that basis, we stop clinging and we experience this stillness or tranquility. So we see how these four things are related. So Uchiyama Roshi says, what we call I, or ego, arises by chance or accident. So we just let go instead of grasping thoughts and I. When we let go of all of our notions about things, everything becomes really true. This is the fourth undeniable reality, or nehan jakujo. It is also described as all things are as they are, shoho jiso. You may know shoho jiso. Todo-san has talked about that, done against away on that. Therefore, when we let go of everything, we do not create artificial attachments and connections. This is the present reality of life. It is the reality of that which cannot be grasped, the reality about which nothing can be said. This very ungraspability is what is absolutely real about things. I think that last sentence is really interesting, right? This very ungraspability is what is absolutely real about things. So in this large absolute sense, real jaku isn't the one where we hold up a yardstick and say there is jaku or there isn't, right? Real jaku kind of, escapes those confines of our distinctions. What is jaku, what is not jaku, right? It escapes all of that, and of course that's a common pattern in Zen, right? We're often seeing the real thing, whatever the thing is. The real thing is beyond real and unreal. It's beyond opposites. It's beyond our sort of discursive thinking. And that's where real stillness is, in not making a distinction between what is stillness and what is not stillness, right? So we use this teaching to transcend the teaching. So there is noise and distraction and upset on the one hand. This is our life, right? And in comparison, there is jaku, peace, silence, tranquility. That's a kind of relative jaku, and the real jaku is about the emptiness or nirvana that we can't grasp in that way. We can't define it, we can't contain it, right? We can't describe it. So this is samadhi as jakujo. But at the end of the gate statement, we have the samadhi of the Tathagata. So next we need to look at that. So again, stillness is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, stillness being jakujo. Stillness is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it realizes and is replete with the samadhi of the Tathagatas. So we've got these two things happening. So first we need to understand what a Tathagata is, right? Sometimes called a thus come one. Tata is thus and gata is to come or go. So the thus come one, someone who moves in suchness or thusness. So Tathagata is one of the 10 names of Buddha, or sometimes 10 epithets of Buddha. So the idea is that his awakening has come because he practiced in a way that other sentient beings, like us, can also practice. And his going and coming are both done in accordance with Dharma, in accordance with suchness or thusness or the real nature of things. So Uchiyama Roshi describes Tata as things being just as they are, or the suchness of things. But right away he warns us not to think that this suchness is a fixed thing, is a fixed state or a fixed entity. It's not something we can go, oh, there, that's suchness, right? Because in the next moment it's something else. This isn't something we can understand through reason, through intellect, through book learning. He says what we experience when we stop grasping and clinging is the reality of life, and that there can't be any other reality outside of that. So we can imagine that the samadhi of a Tathagata, a being that does absolutely everything in accordance with Dharma or suchness, is a pretty powerful thing. So the word that's used here for the Tathagata samadhi is zammai. So hokyo zammai, jiju zammai, we run across zammai quite a bit, right? So this points to the highest possible degree of non-separation. Mind and body, subject and object, person who's sitting, and the universe as a whole, right? This is pointing to the biggest kind of non-separation beyond what we can even imagine, right? So the Tathagata's awakening goes beyond opposites, goes beyond dichotomies in the largest possible way. So within that awakening or samadhi is complete tranquility. And this is where shoho jiso comes in. The true form of all things is beyond opposites, beyond distinctions, discriminations, dividing things up. So they exist within the greatest possible tranquility. So now we have a Tathagata, a being who comes and goes in thusness or suchness, seeing the true form or thusness or suchness of all things. So now we get some sense of the vastness, right? The universality of this kind of awareness, awakening, functioning. We have a being who comes and goes in thusness and sees everything else the same way. So as long as we have opinions and ideas and comparisons, we are subject to disturbance, right? We all know this just from our moment-to-moment being. As soon as we've got an opinion about something, as soon as we're making a judgment about something, we've got some disturbance. We, of course, need to make distinctions so that we can function in this world. We need to know that's a red light, that's a green light, right? We have to be able to discriminate about things so that we can keep this body and mind healthy and do the work that we need to do. If we're not doing that, we call that spiritual bypassing, right? That's just living in the world of the absolute. Oh, well, everything's fine because in the big world there's no distinction, so it doesn't matter what I do, right? We can't live there either. So we have to be able to distinguish a red light from a green light. We have to be able to distinguish candy from medicine, right? We've got to be able to do these things. It's when we tie those distinctions to our sense of self, and we use those distinctions to reinforce our idea that these 5 skandhas are somehow fixed or permanent, or there's something we need to protect. That's when we get into trouble, right? So, can we make distinctions without making judgments? Until somebody, I don't know about you, but until somebody pointed out to me, that's not the same thing. It's like that was an important piece of learning. We can make distinctions without making judgments. I can tell a red light from a green light without having to have an opinion about that. It's like, oh, wait a minute. That's a whole new way to approach what we encounter. So jakujo at the beginning of the Gates statement was aimed at blowing out our fires of delusion and 3 poisons as an expression of the stillness of nirvana. And doing that with this karmic body and mind right here with these circumstances. Zamai at the end of the statement is the most complete, seamless possible manifestation of the harmony of difference and sameness, or the harmony of form and emptiness, right? So the practice of letting go of the 3 poisons, putting out those fires, realizes or makes real, as this statement says, the stillness of nirvana. It's right here, makes it right here, makes it concrete, makes it something we can encounter. And then it's also replete with or completely filled with this stillness without any gaps. So in the same moment we're practicing with this karmic body and mind, we're embodying awakening in a very physical way as bodhisattvas moving through the world, taking concrete action to help beings. And then there's also a complete manifestation of awakening that's not about a limited human being making individual efforts to be a better person, improve things in the world. So, this is not about making individual effort to be wiser or more compassionate or less messed up or something, right? Both of these things are happening in the same moment, in the same place, at exactly the same time. So this isn't some exotic special circumstance. This is our daily practice. It includes our usual mundane activities, the things we do every day just to get along in the world, but we do them without grasping and clinging to impermanent things. So we do those things in an unhindered way. We can wash the dishes without clinging to needing clean dishes, right? We can walk the dog without having an idea about that. So the concentration of samadhi doesn't just happen on the cushion, right? We might think about samadhi as being something that happens only in zazen. And this is telling us, no, we take samadhi off the cushion, right? So we saw that samadhi is about unifying. It's about bringing together things, whether that's body and mind, subject and object, opposite things, dichotomies. Doing our daily activities is the complete expression of that, or as we frequently say here, seeing 2 sides of one reality and expressing those 2 sides in one action. So we're bringing things together. I think this is why work is one of the 3 elements of our practice, right? Zazen, work, and study. Work is not just about taking care of the building. It's not volunteer work. It's actual practice. So we can take work to mean anything that isn't expressly zazen or study, if we want to look at it that way, all the daily activities of our lives. So work is not just taking down the bamboo, cutting grass, right? Sweeping the zendo floor. Yeah, that's work. But let's expand that to say it encompasses all of our daily activities, all the things we do as a bodhisattva, all day long. As practitioners, we can see all of those activities as Buddha's way itself and do them wholeheartedly. Every one of those things is a Dharma gate. Every one of those things is an opportunity to get in touch with that samadhi. So that's samadhi in action, I think. These 5 skandhas are not separate from action as an object. There's no me doing something. How do we unify all of that? How do we see all of that as not separate? That's also a kind of concentration where the self, sort of the small self, steps aside, and there's only the action. So Hoshin has talked about painting doing painting. When you're really painting, the artist leaves the studio, right? So there's something about setting that small self aside. We don't negate it. It's not bad. We're not getting rid of it. We're not criticizing it. It's just there's a bigger picture, right? So practicing like this little by little allows us to respond to what's needed in this moment, to see very clearly what's arising, to respond to what's needed without a sort of self-conscious intention or a self-conscious choice. Oh, such and so is happening, so this person is going to do something, right? There's just this very seamless functioning. Something arises in the moment, it needs to be done, we do it. We don't have an opinion about it, we don't have to think about it. We just do the right action right in that moment. We just see something that needs to be done, we carry that out. So we have to be careful. That's not the same as zoning out, right? It's not about being on autopilot without sort of being aware of the sensory input that's coming in, without being aware of the larger picture of what's going on. It's not to put on blinkers and just sort of not do any thinking, right? So we have to be careful about that, because it might sound like, well, you know, we're just responding to what needs to happen, like we're cut off in some way almost. The point is to be as not cut off as we can be, and yet it would be easy to take that to say, well, I'm just supposed to sort of turn off my brain and function on autopilot. That's not what this teaching is about. We actually can't do this if we're on autopilot. So there was a study in Japan in the mid-'80s about brain waves during Zazen. That it showed that actually practitioners, experienced Zazen practitioners, are actually more aware of stimuli in that place when they're doing that activity. So the researchers made the same sound again and again. It was a kind of a clicking noise. After a while, so they were doing this, they had some lay people who were not experienced in Zazen, and they had some monks who were quite experienced in Zazen. So they kept making this sound. After a while, because they were watching the brainwaves, they noticed the inexperienced people blocked it. So that sensory input kind of stopped coming up. The noise was still happening, but they blocked it. They became habituated to it. There's a favorite word for us, right? But the experienced practitioners kept hearing each sound clearly. They heard every click. In other words, they were dehabituated. And isn't that interesting? So now we all know what it's like to try to sit in the zendo when the clock is ticking. Or the fans, we used to have fans here that would click, you know. It's incredibly annoying, right? I mean, we want to remove all those distractions. I'm sure if, you know, Hoshin is sitting here on a Sunday with us all and he's hearing that stuff, in his mind he's going, how do I get rid of that noise? There's something wrong in the building, right? How do I get rid of that noise? So we want to judge that. We want to label that. We want to shut that out of our awareness. I don't want that in my Zazen, right? I don't want to be experiencing that. So we sort of cut that off. It's the way our brain works. But these dehabituated folks were able to hear that click over and over and over without ever deciding, this is irritating, I want to suppress it. This is irritating, I'm not going to listen to it anymore. They were taking in all that sensory input without coming to conclusion about what that experience was like for them. It's just, there it is again, there it is again, there it is again. So in other words, they eliminated distraction, but not by eliminating sound. Which is interesting. We can do this. We can hear all these things, and we can be distracted by it because we're writing a story, or we can hear all these things and not, you know, and eliminate distraction because we're not writing the story. But the sound doesn't change. What's happening doesn't change. So they had the stillness and they had the silence of jakujo right in the midst of hearing this repetitive, annoying, clicking sound. So I find that a really helpful image about what happens in our day-to-day habituated thinking, right? We see the same thing over and over in our lives, driving to work, whatever it is. We come to some conclusion or opinion about that. We take the same action about it over and over and over again in our lives. We don't even realize we're doing it. And of course, I mean, the human brain can only take in so much stimulus, right? If we were really feeling every rub of our clothes and everything that was happening and trying to process it all, we couldn't do it. So it makes sense that we become habituated to some things. But the Bodhisattva sees the Bodhisattva sees each occurrence with fresh eyes, sees the entirety of the moment, sees all the circumstances, takes the best action regardless of whether that falls into some kind of well-worn track or not. So bodhisattva doesn't get trapped by habituated thinking. So zammai is simply being free from distraction. It's called concentration, but it's not about like staring hard at some particular object or sitting absolutely unmoving in a dark, quiet room with no sensory input, right? We think of concentration, we think of those things. So it's concentration that doesn't have a purpose, or really doesn't even have an object. And we just think, well, how can that be? How can we concentrate on something? How can we unify one-pointedness and all that stuff if there's no object of that? We just think that's not possible. So how can we consider turning that around? It seems impossible to concentrate on everything rather than to concentrate on one thing. But that's one way to think about not being distracted by our discursive stuff. So if concentration is, something we do without distraction, then we have to consider what distraction is and where that comes from and like how we feed that. So we don't need to have a self-conscious intention or a self-conscious goal about that concentration. We just do everything according to suchness or thusness or dharma, just like the Tathagata, right? So we've made our way back to the statement. So in the late 16th or early 17th century, there was an important teacher called Minzon Zuiho. He's one of our favorites here. He was one of a group of reformers who thought that Soto Zen in his time had kind of wandered away from what Dogen was teaching. He wanted to sort of bring everyone back to those teachings and those practices. That's the Reader's Digest version of his life. Please look him up for real. Get the whole story. But he wrote about zammai. And this is Todo-san's translation of what he wrote. This is a bit long, but I think it's helpful, so bear with me, right? Now I will explain in detail the way to clarify and rely on this samadhi. This is done simply by not clouding the light of yourself, capital Self. When the light of the self is clear, you follow neither dullness nor distraction. Dullness and distraction is struck aside, Fukanza Zengi, right? The third ancestor said in Shinshin Ming, when the cloudless light illuminates itself, there is no need to make mental struggle, there is no waste of energy. It is empty, clear, and self-illuminating with no exertion of the mind's power. We'll come back to those things. This is the vital point of the practice enlightenment of this samadhi. Practice enlightenment, not two, right? The cloudless light illuminates itself means the light of the self shines brightly. Not to make mental struggle means not to add the illusory mind's discrimination to the reality. When you make mental struggle, the light becomes illusory mind and brightness becomes darkness. If you do not make mental struggle, the darkness itself becomes the self-illumination of the light. This is similar to the light of a jewel, illuminating the jewel itself. For example, it is like the light of the sun or the moon illuminating everything, mountains and rivers, human beings and dogs, etc., equally without differentiation or evaluation. Also, a mirror reflects everything without bothering to discriminate. Just keep the light of the self unclouded without being concerned with the discrimination of objects. This is the meaning of Hongzhi Chanshi's expression in his Zazen-shin, the be-all or essential function of the Buddhas and the end-all or functional essence of the ancestors, knowing without touching things, illuminating without facing objects. That's a famous phrase we'll come back to. When you practice and learn the reality of Zazen thoroughly, the frozen blockage of illusory mind will naturally melt away. If you think that you have cut off illusory mind, instead of simply clarifying how illusory mind melts, illusory mind will come up again, as though you had cut the stem of a blade of grass or the trunk of a tree and left the root alive. This is very natural. So I think that last part is really important. If we just cut off the functioning of the mind, the sensory input, the thinking process, it's all just going to come back, right? This is what the mind does. So not having thoughts or mental functions is not the point of Zazen. Somehow turning all that off or suppressing it, as we know, is not what we do on the cushion. That's not the point of this thing. There's no forcing. There's no suppressing. There's no struggling with our minds, sort of trying to get our own way, trying to beat our minds into submission, right? There should be nothing forced in this practice. So sometimes we make a lot of effort. Sometimes our bodies and minds get tired. Sometimes practice is not so easy, but there's nothing forced about it. There shouldn't be anything forced about it. It's never about sort of brute force. We're not, forcing ourselves into pretzel-like positions in order to, right? Not what we're here to do. Okay. So instead of doing all of that, we clarify how the mind works, how it grabs that sensory input, makes a judgment, writes a story, creates a sense of self around these 5 skandhas. Then we can let the mind go on doing what it needs to do and supporting our practice and our work as bodhisattvas in the world, but we don't get distracted by that. We don't get tangled up by it. So it's not a question of cutting off what the mind does. It's a question of looking carefully. What's actually happening? Understanding how that works. Then when we do that, it can function, but we don't have to get tangled up in it. So again, it's an important distinction to make. We can know without touching things and illuminate without facing objects. That's a famous phrase from this writing, right? We can encounter and work with whatever happens to come our way without poking our heads in, without making things messy, right? So we can know without touching things, illuminate without facing objects. So in this passage, we have 2 other well-known images for Zanmai. One is the sunlight or moonlight that shines equally on everything. The sun doesn't make any distinction. The other is the mirror that reflects everything equally. So both of those happen without the sun or the moon or the mirror making some discrimination about what gets illuminated or reflected and what doesn't, right? So there's no frozen blockage. I think that's a great image. There's no frozen blockage. There's no mental struggle. There's no wasted energy. There's just total dynamic functioning. Things are coming and going in thusness with no hindrance. So again, stillness or jakujo is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it realizes and is replete with the samadhi of the Tathagata, or Zanmai. So when I first read this, I set out to determine, as I always do, what is the difference between the first samadhi and the second one? Because you know, when I look at these gate statements, I always look at the intersection. There's always something as a Dharma gate because of something. So like, what's the relationship between these 2 things? So what's the relationship between jakujo and Zanmai? You know, I'm asking myself, why is it written this way, using 2 different words and setting up one as a gateway to the other? Like, what's going on there? So of course, in the largest possible sense, there is no difference, right? Samadhi is beyond conceptualization. So beyond whatever distinction we make, beyond whatever description we want to put on it, any way we try to describe it in this limited human functioning is necessarily also limited. So if we say that jakujo leads to Zanmai, it's kind of too linear, right? Because awakening is already here all the time. So we can't really say one awakening leads to another awakening, right? And yet, you know, here's this statement that's trying to make a distinction. So provisionally, what do we take from this statement? How do we learn something from the way this is written? Well, I think we're back to Dogen's great doubt, right? Maybe you got there before me. If awakening is already here all the time, then why do we have to practice? This was his big question, right? This is what he talks about in the first 3 sentences of the Fukan Zazengi. If awakening is already here, what am I doing on the cushion? What am I trying to get? What's going to change? So, of course, ultimately he understands that while awakening is here, we can't always act in accordance with that awakening. We're not always moving around like Tathagatas. We're not always coming and going according to thusness or Dharma, right? So too often we get pulled around by our habituated thinking, by our self-clinging. We sort of forget what Buddha taught. We're kind of caught in our own stuff, in our own world. So if we kind of look at this gate as saying jakujo realizes, makes real, establishes Zanmai, then we can say, well, working to extinguish these fires of the 3 poisons realizes or makes real this awakening that's already here. So our efforts in practice, whether that's zazen work or study, to let go of 3 poisons, to see how delusion comes up in the mind, to let go of our suffering, is a way to make real the awakening that's already here. So this is how we embody the Dharma as bodhisattvas as we go about our work in the world. So zazen work and study all help us in that regard. So in zazen, of course, we drop off body and mind. We concentrate on everything without distinction, without distraction. In work, we actually manifest that awakening by putting aside the small self and becoming completely non-separate, completely one with whatever the activity is that we're doing, so that painting does painting, or zazen does zazen. And so doing that activity it's the activity doing the activity without our human desire for reward somehow getting in the way. I want something out of this activity. I want something to happen because of this activity. Poke our heads in and we make it messy, right? And finally, in study, we turn to teachings and guidelines of people who've been on this path a little longer than we have. We ask them to show us what they've experienced about going through these Dharma gates, about doing this practice, about having these experiences, about settling down to seeing clearly, and then embodying that for the sake of beings. So through our zazen work and study, we can enter into the same awakening as the Buddhas and ancestors. And here we are in this samadhi again. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That awakening, that zammai is already there. It's kind of just waiting for us to realize, make real, right, with this body and mind. So what would you like to say? I'm going to end a little early so we can have time for our world peace. What would you all like to say about stillness, samadhi, all of those things? We'll start with the people here, and then we'll call on people at home. So comments, questions, reflections this morning? I've stunned everyone into jakujo. Please.
So this morning when I was sitting, I always open up the door, sliding glass door to have just cool air and whatnot happen. And when you're talking about the noise, the noise in your zazen, I was listening to the things of what was going on, but just sitting. So guess what? There's a haiku.
Okay, what's your haiku for today?
It goes something like, crickets chirp, frogs croak, a car goes down the street, a loud car goes down the street, just sitting zazen. And sitting can just be being. Mm-hmm. And that, in and of itself, the things that are making the noise, the things that are around you, are you. Just as the wall, just as the cushion, you're all interacting, even though you're just being silent and sitting there. Mm-hmm. So, I thought this was quite fortuitous.
Yeah. Somehow, everything matches up, right? Good. Thank you for that reflection. Other comments, questions from people in the room? Things to ask or offer?
Well, I was wondering about a couple of things. But first, you talked about that making distinctions is not the same thing as making judgments,
mm-hmm.
right? And you used a couple of examples. One was, you see whether the light is green or red, mm-hmm. or you make the distinction between medicine and candy, right? So those are making distinctions. Mm-hmm. But isn't there an implied judgment, like candy's good, but don't get over enthusiastic about it? Have a balanced diet.
Sure.
Things like that. I mean, it seems like distinctions entail judgments, or at least are precursors thereof, because it also informs a decision that I may make.
Sure. And we can get caught up in the language about that, which is always a problem. Of course, the difference is I'm making a judgment about that in such a way that I reinforce my sense of self, right? So yes, I need to determine what action I'm going to take based on making that distinction, but is that about I'm going to do something to aggrandize these five skandhas and make them some fixed and permanent thing or not, right? So we have to make distinctions so we can do our work in the world. But am I making those distinctions about what is good or bad for this one in a way which is about self-clinging? So I use, so I'm using words like judgment and distinction, and of course we can take those various different ways. So you're not wrong, but again we're looking at the motivation. Am I deciding what's good or bad, for me, perhaps at the expense of others, or simply because I'm worried about my public image, or all the things that go with self-clinging, right? So the distinction there is the motivation. Does that make sense?
It does. It just flows right into part two.
Uh-oh, I've set myself up.
Because you also discussed that there's two different words for samadhi in this.
In this particular gate statement.
This particular gate, and maybe I'm going a little bit too far in this. I'm not sure, but you read the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, Academy should, even though it's not necessarily Buddhist, but has a Buddhist influence. It talks about two different kinds of samadhi. Actually, it talks about different layers of samadhi.
There's 108 of them, depending on what you're looking at.
But there's broadly, in the Yoga Sutra, there's broadly two categories. There's dualistic and non-dualistic. So there's the samadhi in which I am experiencing the samadhi, and there's a samadhi in which there is no I that experiences it. And I wonder if that would fit in this.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think when we look at, it seems to me the same pattern as two kinds of nirvana, right? There's the nirvana that we still have this karmic human body, and then there's the nirvana that we pass beyond the limitations of this karmic human body. So whether it's identical, I don't know, because I'm not deeply familiar with that text, but I certainly see a pattern that says, there's the world of form and there's the world of emptiness. There's the world where, I have to, when someone says, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to go sit zazen now. But if I'm actually sitting zazen, it's zazen sitting zazen, right? So we have these two sides of this one reality, and we're expressing both sides in one activity. So in that kind of, so we can make that kind of distinction, but we know it's provisional. So I certainly see a pattern there, absolutely. I think that's right. Other things in this room? Questions, reflections, comments, things to share? How about folks at home? Doju is paying attention to you so he can help facilitate, because I can't see the monitor. So maybe Doju can call on people or facilitate that.
Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
Hi, so I also appreciated the comment on looking at distinctions versus judgments, and kind of struggled with the judgment part, could we live without judgments? But I wondered if some part of the problem would come from not seeing judgments as merely just useful ways of categorizing distinctions, or not appreciating the self-centered kind of foundation of many of our judgments.
Yeah. So again, I think we have to be careful about spiritual bypassing, because if we simply say all discrimination, all judging is always bad 100% of the time, now we've fallen into this binary thinking, which is not helpful, right? So this is not about saying we should never make a choice. We have to make a choice. We couldn't function, we couldn't live, we couldn't move through the world. So we have to make a choice, but we can look carefully at how are we making the choices, and then how are we, what's the follow-on to the choice? So am I making the choice from a self-centered, self-clinging point of view, or am I making that distinction without sort of poking my head into it? So our habituated thinking says, I evaluate everything, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, for this one. And we certainly have to do that. If we're making a distinction between candy and medicine, we better know what's the effect on this one, right? Or we're going to have some trouble. We certainly need to make choices about the direction of our lives. What profession am I going to take up? Am I going to get married or not? Am I going to buy this house or not, right? I mean, we have to make choices, and that has to be, and of course there's quite a bit of motivation there about how am I living my life and what's my experience of this human form and all of that. And so these teachings are never going to say we ignore those things, we suppress them, those things are bad. What we have to look at is, are we caught up in it? Are we caught up in it in a way that's unwholesome? Are we caught up in it in a way that feeds the three poisons, that breaks precepts, that hinders our practice? That's where we get to look carefully. So, of course, this is not easy, right? We're in the middle of this. The fish doesn't see the water. We're in the middle of all of this habituated thinking. It's very difficult for us to step back and kind of, wait a minute, why did I choose this over that? Maybe if we're making big life choices, we're doing that kind of discernment, but on a moment-by-moment basis, we typically don't, right? So, here comes Zazen, right? We get to drop off body and mind. We get to just sit without being forced to make those kind of judgments, and we get to see what that's like, and we get to enter into that space and go, oh, wait a minute, it is possible to make choices without being caught up in three poisons. It is possible to make distinctions without feeding suffering. It's like, oh, until somebody points that out to you, that those are not necessarily the same thing, that's just not the way the brain works, right? We think every choice is about this one. Now, wait a minute, what if I step back? What if small self goes over here? Now, would I see that the same way? Would I do the same thing? So we're constantly looking at motivation, right? So, I think you raise a good point, because we don't want to get trapped in this pitfall that says all choices are bad. I'm going to live in this world of spiritual bypassing, because this is where we get into ethical trouble, right? It doesn't matter what I do, because in the end everything is empty. So it doesn't matter if I hurt people, kill people, take their stuff, misuse sexuality, talk badly about people, right? Because in the end, oh, well, it's all one big thing and there's no distinction to be made. Well, talk about perpetuating suffering, right? So we need both sides, right? We have to see two sides of one reality and express both of those in one action. Is that enough for you, Neil? Do you want to follow up?
No, thank you. That was very helpful.
Because you know I'll just keep talking. Other folks at home?
Ado has a question. Ado, go ahead, please.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to share something related to this, which is, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, which is kind of similar to what Mark shared, and that is, this is a little story. So, Hokyoji is a Zen practice center in Minnesota, and somebody was planning a retreat at a time when someone was going to be moving in at Hokyoji. And this person was concerned because how disruptive this would be to the sesshin. And which is understandable, but also we had an interesting conversation about what is the difference between the sound of this person moving in and the birds making their nest or their cows mooing. You know, it's all the sounds of life. But we are already, before we've even experienced it, making this judgment. And I think that's a helpful to just discern between distinction and judgment. Because I think you can make distinctions without judgment. But this is clearly judgment. Having human sounds is going to be very disrupting. And therefore it's going to be, this person is going to be suffering and going to be very distracted by this. And so the question, is it possible not to make that judgment, not to be distracted by it, but let's just let it be part of the flow of life that's happening, whether it's that or the cars going by, or, you know, it's not like some sounds are positive and some are negative. They're sounds. Anyway, and I think it is. Anyway, I guess, so that's an example of kind of making that difference. And this person changed her mind and decided that, oh, I guess it doesn't need to be a problem. I mean, and she was able to kind of see it differently and make a different decision about it and let it go, kind of let it go. She wasn't going to let it bug her. Anyway, that was kind of, similar to what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? How it might be we don't want any sounds, all sounds are distracting or all sounds are bad, and then we start to make a choice. Well, some sounds are okay. If it's a natural sound, why, then it's okay. But if it's a human sound, then it's not so okay. I remember reading many years ago somebody saying something like, you know, we ought to be able to do zazen in a train station, in a bus station. It shouldn't matter. We can go to the shopping center and sit zazen. It shouldn't matter. Well, that's really interesting, because it sort of takes zazen off the cushion in a certain kind of way, but you just think what's coming through should just be coming through in an unhindered way. That story reminds me of when I moved out of Hokyoji. Doju came to help me, and I moved out of Hokyoji, and I guess was I moving here? Yeah, I wasn't moving to Milwaukee. I'd already been to Milwaukee, so I was moving here. So, and that was happening, I think, at the end of a session.
Yeah, there's one going on.
Yeah, we went and sat the session, and then the last thing that happened in the session was, you know, you and I in our parade of truck and all that came out. Then I just thought, I've never been to a session like this before. So that must be Hokyoji's karma.
It was truly a moving experience.
It was truly a moving experience, that's right. Well, if I hadn't had Doju there, my goodness, I don't know how I would have got everything out of there. Okay, thank you for that, Ado. Other people at home, something to add, ask, say, share? Everyone good? All right. Okay, so thank you for an interesting discussion. Let's go ahead and do our closing chant, and we will move on to our world peace ceremony, so don't run away. It's nice to have lots of voices for that. So thanks, everybody.